The wildest and most thrilling night of my life was that one. That incident occurred on a calm Friday. On my back, I lay. I felt lonely, my thoughts disorganized and restless, as I stared at the dim patterns of moonlight on the ceiling. I had not seen my husband Ethan for 3 weeks, and he was going to be abroad on a business trip for the next 2 months, so it wasn't until the door creaked softly that I knew I wasn't alone. I sat up a little and looked at the dim form at the doorway. The dim light from the hallway highlighted my 19-year-old son Nathan's broad shoulders as he stood there. He hesitated, one hand clutching the door frame as if it were the only thing holding him upright. "Mom," he said softly, his voice laced with hesitation. I rubbed my eyes, my heart already constricted at the sound of his voice. "What's the matter, Nathan?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he remained motionless, his shadow extending over the room, until at last he entered, his bare boots thudding softly on the carpet. His tentative, almost fearful movements caused the room's air to feel heavier for some reason. He replied, "I couldn't sleep," in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper. I looked at my bedside clock, which read 2:14 a.m. Unless something truly bothered him, Nathan was not the kind to wake me up. With my chest constricted, I threw my legs over the edge of the bed and gestured for him to approach. "What is happening?" He paused once more before sitting on the edge of the bed with his stance rigid after I asked him softly. He clutched his fists firmly in his lap. I briefly observed him waiting, but he continued to stare at the ground. I could practically feel the tension in his body. "Nathan," I whispered quietly, "you can talk to me. In any case, I'm here." His fingers fumbled with the hem of his t-shirt as he shook his breath. "It's difficult to describe." Finally, he remarked, "I've been feeling something. I haven't been feeling the same, and I'm not sure how to handle it." His remarks caused me to feel uneasy. In contrast to the way he looked at me, I leaned forward a little and spoke steadily despite the knot in my stomach. His eyes then searched mine with fierce, "I wasn't prepared for it's about someone I've been thinking about a lot, someone you are not going to expect relief," flared through me for a second. Perhaps this had to do with a girl at school, an infatuation with whom he was unsure how to deal. Nathan had always been reticent about expressing his emotions, holding them within until they seemed ready to explode. I smiled reassuringly at him and said, "Okay. Who is it?" "Someone from school was involved." His eyes dropped once again as he gave a brief shake of his head. His voice was almost heard when he answered, "No." "If it's not a schoolmate, then who is it?" I applied pressure. "You may tell me whatever it is, Nathan, and we'll work it out." But slowly, a weird uneasiness was starting to seep into my chest. He drew in his breath. He began again, his voice shaking, his chest rising and falling as though he were drawing on all the bravery he possessed. He said, "It's you, Mom, at last. It's always you." For a minute, I was unable to talk or think as the words hit me like a tidal wave and pulled the breath out of my lungs. My mind tried to process what he had just said, but the weight of it left me reeling. "Nathan," I muttered, my voice trailing off. "How about this?" "You say what?" With a start, he paced the room like a cage while his hands tugged at his hair, perhaps attempting to physically remove the words from his memory. He answered hastily, "I understand how it sounds. Even though I know it's wrong, I can't help myself. I've made countless attempts to ignore it and push it away, but it never goes away." I gazed at him, my heart thumping so loudly that I could hardly hear what he was saying. "It's not real, Nathan." "I know how I feel," he interjected, his voice shaking. "Don't tell me it's not real." Never before have I felt this strongly for another person. It's something far more than appreciation or some dumb crush. "Mom, Nathan," I pleaded again, my voice shaking. "You're my son, and what you are experiencing is not love, but rather something else. It is affection." He yelled, "You're everything to me, Mom," in an emotionally charged voice. "The only person who has ever helped me feel valuable and who has ever understood me is you." Tears welled up in my eyes as I attempted to comprehend what he was saying. My kid, my darling son, whom I had reared and loved without conditions, was expressing emotions that I couldn't comprehend and that I couldn't return, but now that I think about it, I'm delighted. I believe I haven't noticed it yet. He turned to face me, his eyes glossy with unshed tears, his jaw set with resolve. I guess I tried to dismiss it, so I responded, Nathan, you're confused. You're going through a lot right now, and maybe these feelings I'm not puzzled by. That triggered a deep ache in my chest. At the time I realized it, I was more certain than I had ever been in my life. I was aware of his attraction to me and didn't want to ignore it, but since I am his mother, I accepted responsibility. Responsibility to disregard it. I extended my hand and touched his arm. I murmured softly, these emotions will pass, Nathan. Do you see things more clearly after they pass? I assure you that they will. What if they don't? In a whisper, he said. He broke off, what if this is who I am? What if I was intended to feel my throat constrict like this, and was momentarily unable to speak? All I could do was cling to the notion that time would bring clarity, and that this moment wouldn't define us since I didn't know how to answer his questions, or how to soothe the grief that was so obvious in his eyes. In this, you're not alone. I eventually answered, frightened but determined, Nathan, we'll get through it. We stared at each other for an extended period, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that shattered my heart. Mom, I don't want to lose you, he whispered rather quietly. I cannot let you go. I said, you won't. Squeezing his arm tightly, I told him that I would always be there. You know what? Why don't we get together tonight? Perhaps that would be somewhat helpful, I murmured, slipping back beneath my blankets. I took him with me after he nodded and walked gently into the bed. I felt something, but I didn't tell him, so I simply murmured, good night, sweetie. He then grinned at me. After that, there was a heavy but comfortable stillness. I felt a glimmer of hope that we could weather this storm, no matter how impossible it seemed, as he closed his eyes. It was the kind of silence that held promises that were sincere but fragile, and I knew deep down that this was just the beginning. I was right. A night like this was coming again, and this time, nothing happened, but more was on the horizon. I had no clue what the morning after Nathan's revelation would bring about, for love, especially love this complicated, does not fade in silence. I busied myself with chores in the hopes that the routine would ground me, but my hands trembled as I folded laundry, and my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What did this mean for us? Him, for me? The home's normally comforting quiet felt like a suffocating weight pressing down on me. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a chair clattering in the kitchen. Gazing into a bowl, Nathan sat at the table. His eyes were shaded by fatigue, his hair disheveled, and he had a bowl of cereal that appeared as untouched as my coffee on the counter. We hadn't slept, he and I combined. In the morning, I replied warily, breaking the stillness as he glanced up with an inscrutable face. He responded in the morning, and when I made a fresh cup of coffee for myself, the sound of the liquid filling the mug was louder than it should have been. The space between us felt both too great and too little when I sat down at the table with him. We both remained silent for a moment. The silence hung heavy in the air. Nathan and I were silent about last night until I finally spoke out. I wanted to say that, but he cut me off. Despite the chaos in his eyes, I won't act as though I didn't close my eyes for a moment and force myself to remain composed. This is how you're feeling, Nathan, I continued quietly, but I know you're being honest. It's not something we should do, and it's not something we can do. Why not? He sat back in his chair and gripped the edge of the table with his palms. In a frustrated tone, he questioned, why must love adhere to rules and boundaries? I inhaled deeply, trying to find the proper words, wondering whether love shouldn't be free. As I mentioned before, Nathan, love is about what's right and beneficial for all parties, and this is what you're saying, it might be harmful to us both. His jaw was clenched as he turned aside, tightening. He whispered softly, I don't want to hurt you. We need to handle this carefully because I don't want to harm you either, and that's the last thing I want, I replied, reaching across the table to put a hand over his. I briefly saw the youngster he used to be, the boy who had taken my hand in times of fear and who had turned to me for direction, as his fingers tightened around mine. We must find a way to get past this. As well as ease, but this was different. He no longer looked at me the same way. Tears filled my eyes, and I gently squeezed his palm as he whispered, I don't know if I can move past it. but I'll try for you. For the days that followed, it's all I asked for. Were a haze of uncomfortable chats and imposed normality. Nathan made an effort to avoid contact. I convinced myself that it was best for him to spend time away from home or retreat to his room in order to work through his emotions. But I missed him and the easy rapport we had before everything changed from the night he admitted that we shared the same bed every night. One evening, while I was making dinner, I noticed that there was a gap between us. The entrance door opened and closed, and Nathan entered the kitchen with wet hair. From the downpour, he gazed at me for a long time, perhaps contemplating whether or not to speak. "Hello," I said, attempting to seem casual. "Dinner is almost done, and you're just in time." His response was incorrect. Rather than walking away, he crossed his arms and leaned on the counter. His eyes remained fixed on what I had said that evening, and I swallowed hard, bracing myself as I turned off the stove and faced him, my heart wondering what about us. I knew right away the night he was referring to. Naturally, I thought, Nathan. We both agreed. I am aware that he interrupted, but I will not argue. I really must say something. I nodded and gestured for him to go on. With a quiet but strong voice, he replied, "I've been trying to figure out what to do with these feelings, and I concluded that, even if it's not what I want, I don't want to lose what we have, Mom." A wave of relief flooded over me, tempered by the pain in his voice. "Nathan, you're not going to lose me. I would rather have you in my life as my mother than risk losing you. I promised that I would always be here." He nodded, his lips forming a thin line. "For you. It's difficult, but I know." "It's extremely difficult," I said as I moved in closer and touched his arm. "Time will be needed. But you're strong, Nathan, and I'll do all in my power to support you through this," I added softly. The tension between us appeared to subside for a time as his eyes locked with mine. His voice was quiet as he responded, "Thanks, Mom." "That's quite significant." We stood in the kitchen with the rain hammering against the windows, and for the first time in days, I thought we would be all right. However, life often complicates matters unexpectedly, and just when I believed we had achieved a certain level of tranquility, an unexpected event unfolded, threatening to unravel everything. The tense truce Nathan and I had made worked for a while, but it was fragile. He tried to join me for meals, grin more, and laugh at my jokes. Like he used to, I tried to convince myself that things were getting better by holding on to those times. However, after a hard day of work, late at night, when the house was quiet and I was by myself with my thoughts, the weight of his confession remained. In the living room, I discovered Nathan. He looked up as I entered the room, sitting on the couch, and stared blankly at the TV as an old sitcom's laugh track echoed strangely in the otherwise silent room. "You okay?" His look is inscrutable. While seated next to him, I inquired. Then he shrugged. Yes, he laughed softly, but without any amusement, as he thought that I had paused before saying anything specific. Why haven't I considered this? It made my stomach turn. "I thought we were going to get over this, Nathan." With haste, he responded, "I'm trying. Though it's not that easy, I truly am. Feelings are not something you can just turn off. For the benefit of both of us, we must continue to work on this, even if I know I spoke lightly and I don't expect you to." He looked at me and then into my eyes. "Have you considered it before?" His voice was low as he questioned abruptly about us and what it would be like if things were different. I was surprised when I froze his inquiry. "I'm telling the truth, Nathan." I turned my head away as he continued, "Just tell me the truth," in a tone that was more begging than commanding. It was a convoluted, complex truth, in feelings I couldn't quite comprehend. Naturally, I had considered it. He sighed, stroking his hair. How could I not after what he'd said? Admitting those thoughts, even to myself, felt like stepping over a boundary I couldn't reverse. It doesn't matter what I thought I said, finally forcing my voice to remain steady. What matters is doing the right thing, and this isn't right. "I know you think that, but what if?" I interrupted Elle, saying, "No, Nathan, there is no what if. No, we won't have this chat." He looked at me for a while with a dejected and frustrated expression. At last, he whispered, "You're afraid." Sure, I was lying. I was afraid he was correct about that, but for the wrong reason. This isn't just about you or me, though. It's about all we've achieved and everything we stand to lose. I was afraid to tell him that I had been feeling something for the past several days as well. He didn't react, and the stillness that followed was deafening. At last, with methodical and rigid motions, he rose up and stated, "I'm going for a walk," before making his way to the door. I started, "Nathan," but he was gone. As I sat at the window, watching the street, the hours went very slowly, each minute seeming to drag on forever. My anxiety grew every time Nathan failed to return. Not until almost midnight did I hear the door open. I ran to the doorway. As I saw him enter the house, drenched from the rain, I felt a wave of relief. "Where have you been, Nathan?" With a quivering voice, I asked. "Walking," he stated plainly, trembling with his hair's moisture. I went to the restroom and got a towel and gave it to him. "You're going to get sick," I murmured, my displeasure leaking out of my concern. He ran the towel across his face and moaned, "You can't just disappear like that." I needed to get my thoughts straight. Did it help? With my arms crossed, I asked. His dark, unfathomable eyes first glanced at me. I didn't hesitate at all because of anything in his tone. I moved in closer and said, "Nathan, we can't continue this way. It's destroying us both." I'm aware that he spoke in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper, but I'm at a loss for words. I mentioned we could need assistance. A bitter smile curled his lips as he looked for someone to talk to, a therapist. You assume that the therapist will comprehend this. Though I wasn't positive, I thought they may, or at least they might, assist us in deciding how to proceed. With the towel on the ground, he shook his head and said, "Mom, nobody can fix this. Nobody can alter my feelings." His comments lingered in the atmosphere, relentless and weighty. I wanted to dispute with him and tell him that he was wrong, but I couldn't because I knew in my heart that he was right. What's worse is that I still hadn't admitted to him that I felt something that night as well, and that I was the one who was lying to him. I kept my tongue quiet, at least for the time being, even though I knew that I was attempting to hide my feelings for him too. Nathan tried to be normal, but the tension between us was evident in every encounter, which felt like walking a tightrope, and I couldn't get rid of the uneasy sense that something was going to break. The next few days were a haze of avoidance and awkward talks. One evening, when we were tidying up after supper, that creature appeared. Throughout the day, Nathan had been abnormally silent. As I filled the dishwasher, he leaned against the counter and watched me, his actions methodical and stiff. He said, "Mom." The stillness was abruptly broken by his voice. "I have something to tell you." His voice was shaking as he continued, "What is it?" "I can't do this anymore." I turned to face him, my pulse racing. "Nathan, I can't keep acting like everything is all right." I said, "We've talked about this," but he shook his head. He raised his voice and shouted, "No, you don't understand. I can't simply shut off how I feel. I can't keep acting like I'm all right when I'm not. What do you want me to do then?" My irritation boiled over as I asked. He continued, his voice shaking, "What do you expect me to say?" "I don't know. I simply, truly to get how much this is shattering me, you must see me. It crushes my heart to see you like this, Nathan, but I don't know how to solve it." "I do see you," I answered, my voice quivering. "I see you every day." He stepped forward, his gaze meeting mine. "It is unfixable. Maybe we don't have to," he added. "What are you saying, Nathan?" I asked him as I glanced at him, my head spinning. He didn't respond. Instead, he drew closer to me. My breath seized the air between us as his hand touched mine, but the moment was brief. I moved away, disconnecting the connection. "No," I answered firmly, trembling. "No, we can't. No, we can't." His face collapsed, each line marked by sorrow. He said in a whisper, "I'm sorry," and turned to go. I remained there, my pulse pounding, the reality of what had occurred weighing heavily on me because, despite my best efforts to deny it, something inside of me had reacted to him, and that scared me more than anything else. As I reflected on our past evenings together, I realized that he had been caressing me more than usual the past 2 nights, and I had reciprocated by doing more to him. I believe he saw it and initiated the conversation, but the days that followed that kitchen encounter were chaotic and stressful, like navigating a hurricane. Nathan and I avoided one another more than ever before. When we did, our silences shouted more than words. I loudly reminded myself that we both needed the space, but every time I watched him withdraw to his room or saw the glint of agony in his eyes, it broke my heart. The way he looked at me, the weight of his words, and how my heart had betrayed me in that little, fleeting moment of connection were all things I replayed over and over again over the night. It wasn't right, it wasn't, but ignoring the depth of our feelings only seemed to make the hurt worse. There was a book in my lap, neglected, one evening while I sat in the living room. Nathan entered. He paused at the threshold, perhaps uncertain of his reception. He looked up, attempting to maintain a neutral appearance, and said, "What's up?" His hair was disheveled, and his attitude guarded. This was the moment I just had to confess. Just tell him what I felt. "Nathan," I murmured at last, my voice softer than normal. Paced gently close to the edge of the coffee table, moving more into the room without sitting. I said that I wanted to speak. "I know it has been difficult since you looked at me for a moment and then looked away again." He nodded, putting the book down and closing it for the two of us. "However, I don't want you to believe I don't care, Mom. You're unaware of how much I do." He paused. "I know you care," pacing and looking at me. "This is the reason it's so difficult," I said. Because he said, "I can't, Mom, no matter how much I try to let go, no matter how much I tell myself to move on." But I raised a hand. "All right," I responded. The more I think about it, the more I understand that it's okay to feel love, even if it doesn't match the rules. I've spent a lot of time trying to find out why I feel this way and what's wrong with me. I swallowed hard, my own words hitting a deep chord if it frightened others. I answered cautiously, love isn't wrong, but sometimes acting on it is, especially when it could hurt the people we care about. He nodded slowly, as though he had anticipated that response, but still needed to hear it. He acknowledged that I do, but what should I do with these emotions? Bury them? Act as if they are non-existent? No, I answered at last, shaking my head. You are not required to act. In order to assist you in transforming your emotions into something that advances your growth rather than stifling it, I will share something I too need to confess. That's easier said than done, Mom, he murmured, lowering his shoulders in the chair opposite from me. But tell me what you have to. Confess well, Nathan, I whispered. I believe you may have done so already. Observed it a little bit throughout the last few nights while we were sleeping together. He didn't answer for a second, but then, to my astonishment, he laughed quietly. I noticed, of course, but I persuaded myself that you did it to cheer me up. You're touched, he said. They just serve to confuse me. They make me feel as though I'm getting nearer to what I desire yet still far away. You're not lost. You're just finding your way, and that's okay, I added, bending forward. It's a natural part of growing up. He gave me a glance, and then his eyes became vulnerable, which made my chest hurt. He responded, I don't want to lose you, Mom. I cannot let you go. I responded in a stern voice, you won't. That won't change. I'm here, no matter what. My heart was racing in my chest at the time, and I hadn't yet expressed to him how I felt or that those touches weren't only for him. They were also a result of what I really wanted, so I decided to stop letting him get in the way. I had to get my thoughts straight and tell him how I felt, but let me say this first. Nathan, those touches weren't meant to cheer you up. They stated I did it because I felt something. 2. As I admitted, Nathan, I still have feelings for you. I didn't want to tell you. Because I am your mother, it is wrong. Our feelings for one another cannot be real, yet I am unable to ignore my feelings. He remained quiet for a while before leaning in and snatching my leg. Let's not do this, Nathan, I said. He muttered, what about Dad? We can't let anyone know. Despite this, I could see reluctance in his eyes and moved in to give him a quick but passionate kiss. He wasn't sure, and I realized we couldn't do this, so I pulled him away. Just make sure you get a decent night's sleep, and we'll chat tomorrow, I said. He nodded, but the tension was palpable to us both. Was still there. After getting into my pajamas, we both proceeded to the bathroom to wash our teeth and get ready for bed. As he was washing his face, I gave him a grin. We had been sleeping together for the last several weeks since the first night of his confession, so it was rather typical for him when I walked to the bedroom and slid into my bed. As I mentioned earlier, the tension was still present, so I opened the sheets for him to step into before he reached the bed. He came into the room a few moments later and said, "Let's just make sure we take some good rest, and then we discuss all this tomorrow before Dad returns, okay?" He said that it seemed as though he had already accepted that nothing would happen, but I had not. Regretfully, I switched off the nightlight and turned my back on him, saying, "Good night, honey." "Good night, mother." A few minutes seemed to drag on for hours, and I could hear my mind racing with ideas. He didn't look away as my foot briefly brushed his leg, somewhat intentionally and partially accidentally, and I quickly drew him in. When he grabbed my leg, I spun around. Even though I hesitated for a second, I allowed everything to happen. I gave him a kiss, but we went beyond that. I felt alive for the first time in a long time when I closed my eyes and allowed the moment to wash over me. I won't delve into the details of what transpired, but for a brief moment, I experienced a sense of aliveness, erasing all the worries that had plagued me over the previous few weeks. No, this wasn't incorrect. Perplexing. It was the type of love that had developed organically between us as a result of years of nurturing and trust, love that was straightforward and genuine. And comprehension, I reminded myself throughout our hectic time together, yet it went by just as fast as it began. It must have been a little too thrilling for him. Nathan grinned at me when he withdrew, as I can imagine. "We are all okay." Yes, I agreed and headed to the restroom. The next few weeks improved. More relaxed, even if there were still times when our differences resurfaced. His father had come back, and he began spending more time outside. I immersed myself in my routines, finding solace in the small daily tasks that kept life moving, spending time with friends, and even resuming some of the hobbies he had abandoned in the previous year. However, as much as I wanted to think that we were getting over our past, the undercurrent of what had happened between us persisted. Neither of us was able to completely break free from the unseen thread that held us together. To date, I have not disclosed what transpired to my spouse, and neither have Nathan and I discussed it. Both what to do and how to think about it are unknown to me. What do you think about it? My purpose in sharing this tale is to see what other people think about it. In addition to the fact that I will never be able to go back, I cannot deny that what happened is bizarre.